Please welcome BSA CEO Victoria Espinel and Jason Kwon, General Counsel at OpenAI.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. Welcome back. Very excited to be here today with Jason Kwon, the General Counsel of OpenAI. Jason, welcome to Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, great to be here.
So there's a lot of interest in OpenAI. I'm going to start off with a really fundamental question.
Yeah.
What is OpenAI? How would you explain it?
Yeah, so OpenAI was started as a research and development company focused on trying to build artificial general intelligence. It was founded in 2015. It was originally focused on trying to build these technologies and bring them into the world in a way that's safe and beneficial. For the benefit of all humanity is what's written to our charter. And then I think around 2019, we created this for-profit arm that then, is creating the technologies and deploying them, and had this partnership with Microsoft. And so that is like kind of the moment in which we started to productize some of these things, and ultimately led to the release of ChatGPT. And I think from the very beginning, it's always been about not just technological development, but also kind of understanding the social impacts and figuring out how to do these things and deploy these things in a way that society could adapt, and that the deployment is done in a responsible manner.
So ChatGPT is one product, right? I'd love to hear a little bit about how you think ChatGPT, but also other generative AI products if you want, how do you think they have changed, will change how we live our lives?
Yeah, so it was definitely an interesting moment, back in November when ChatGPT was launched, and I think it was maybe one of the early times, if not the first time, that ordinary or regular people could actually interface with a technology or tool or product that was very visibly AI. We've definitely had that in our lives before, but this is one where there's all this direct interaction, and there's a lot of surprise, and at the capabilities it's able to kind of perform. And I think my parents use it. They're over 70 years old, and they are native Korean speakers, and it's able to converse with them in Korean, and they find that really fun and educational as well. And then you have other sort of more complex situations where you have like Khan Academy building on top of our technologies to kind of try to bring home the idea of having your personalized AI tutor that helps with education. So there's just kind of this wide span of activities that kind of goes through and impacts lots of different things in terms of what you're doing in use cases that, it's very clear that you're interacting with an AI system.
So you've been at OpenAI for about 3 years now, is that right?
A little over 2.
A little over 2 years.
Yeah.
So you had a chance to see some things before others had a chance to see them. Is there a moment you look back on when you were watching developmental capabilities and you were like, wow, this is something really new, really amazing?
Yeah, well, it was probably just in the first few weeks that I joined.
So early on.
Yeah, early on, and it's just when impressions are being formed too. Had a sense of some of the capabilities because GPT-3 had been launched, but this was before the code generation capabilities were widely released. And I think in the past, before I moved into law, I was a software developer, and so kind of understood the work that kind of goes into developing code, and then kind of seeing people and developers write code through natural language commands was kind of shocking to me. It still kind of is really, really impressive, and you sort of forget about it a little bit because it's been a while now that these capabilities have been out there. But that one really kind of really surprised me from the very beginning.
So you talked a little bit about it's consumer facing, and we were talking a little bit before about the fact that there's been so much consumer facing interest in it. There's been this real explosion of interest in it. We can talk a little bit later on about how that may or may not be changing the policy debate around artificial intelligence. But what about enterprise facing uses? Is that something you all are thinking about?
Yeah. So before there was chat, and I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize this because it's a little bit less visible, but we had an API, application programming interface, that developers could then access the models and build on top of. And that had been around for I think about 1.5 years before chat had come out. You have companies, developers building on top of these tools. A couple of use cases that kind of come to mind. One is you might have a company with a large knowledge base, and instead of people having to look up information, you can put an AI system on top of it that then will be able to understand what you have inside the organization, and you can sort of interact with the organizational knowledge, and that can make everybody more productive. We definitely have customers using it in that way. And then I think the other use case is sort of making more efficient and more powerful the existing capabilities that you have. If you're, for example, a software business, you can add sort of interactive features into your software. This, for example, one kind of use case that occurs to me is Intercom is using it for their sort of Q&A platform that they have to kind of deal with things as common as customer support. So those are just a couple of examples. I think there are more you can think of impact in internal workflows as well as making the existing products that people offer a lot more powerful.
Have you seen a lot of interest from enterprise-facing companies? It's my impression that there has been.
Yeah. So the interesting thing has been that when it first came out, a lot of companies were sort of, how do I think about this? How do I integrate this into my products? And I think now, with Chat having been out there, ChatGPT being out there, people sort of realize, okay, so that is a very clear way of interacting with this technology. And another kind of use case revealed by this is you can use natural language now as an interface into software. Before, you had to kind of design this kind of user interface, buttons, drop downs, all that. Now what you can do is converse with the software, and it will be able to do things. And that's kind of, I think, where this is headed.
So there's been a lot of focus on technology generally and the benefits, but also the risks and the challenges that technology faces. This is not specific to AI. This is in general. But it does feel like there's an intensity to this moment. And I'd be curious about your thoughts. Not just, I'll ask you about OpenAI, but more generally, you're in Silicon Valley. You have a long history in working for tech companies, startups, incubators. Does this feel different to you? And what I mean specifically is, how do you think other tech companies are thinking about this moment in terms of responsible deployment, in terms of research and investment? Like, what's the mood in Silicon Valley right now?
Yeah, I think it's a mix of excitement and concern, for sure. And I think the thing that makes this different than before is, one is a function of what's come before, right? And I think everybody knows that technology has had great impact on society, some of it unintended, and that this time around there's more pre-thinking to do on a lot of these issues. And so I think that's one. I think the second is it's definitely disruptive, and especially in the sense of what is software capable of doing. And I think there's just a sense that there's a lot here to kind of unpack and also kind of understand what are the second order implications. And so the technology itself is one that I think everybody's still trying to understand. And then I think the third here is sort of as a combination of the two, that, okay, how do we do this in a way where you have industry cooperation on standards, and how do you do this in a way where regulators and policymakers can sort of strike the right balance between innovation and safety. And those conversations I think are happening quite rapidly, because of both of these things. People are trying to wrap their head around it. And, I think there are things that have happened in the past that people don't want to see happen again.
So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
with respect to OpenAI specifically. And I'm going to pick one of those risks. Well, actually, before I do that, when you are thinking about OpenAI, what are the risks that you're most concerned about? What are you expecting? What's been unexpected?
Yeah, so from the beginning, we've had a team at OpenAI that focuses on these types of questions. And I think when these generative models first came out, because they're able to create content, because they're able to create information, one of the key things that I think people kind of zeroed in on is, okay, well, this could be used to generate disinformation, misinformation, inaccurate things. And that was also kind of very current at that time, because you had all these things happening, for example, in social media. When these tools were released, what actually ended up happening is that people were the first kind of use case that of misuse that we kind of saw was people kind of generating this stuff for offensive outputs, toxic outputs. So that was the first problem that we had to solve, and we had to develop safeguards to sort of moderate this content automatically. In retrospect, that seems fairly obvious, but it wasn't like the first thing that people were thinking about. And I think the learning there is just you can articulate these risks, and it's the disinformation risk I think is still a real one, but you also have to keep an open mind that paying attention to actually what's happening on the ground, because the way that this stuff might unfold it might unfold a little bit differently, and so there's just a kind of this need to be constantly adaptive and to let the facts kind of come and deal with them as they are.
And so how do you try to manage that internally? Because you said there's been kind of explosion. I know you have a very big team. We were talking about that before. I'm joking. I know you have a team that is hopefully will be rapidly growing. Mm-hmm. But how do you manage all of the risk that's out there?
Yeah.
Or how do you think about that?
Yeah. I think part of it is that just building on the existing framework that we've already had. And so I can talk a little bit about that, which is, we have the latest model, GPT-4. It's part of ChatGPT. It was released, back in March. It's still limited in terms of its access. But before that was released into chat, there was, about 6-7 months of safety testing, red teaming, looking at the results, those would kind of, surface things that the systems could do that we didn't necessarily want them to do. We had to come up with mitigations. We still come up with safeguards and mitigations as we see the activity kind of roll out. And so we call that our iterative deployment process. And there's a bunch of stuff written on our blog that you can read up on about it. And I think it's just making sure that we continue to do that and try our best to kind of keep pace with the rate of growth. I think find the right people, add them to the organization, continue to beef up the framework, talk about the framework more, engage with policymakers, engage with other technology companies, and how do we take these sort of components of what we've done as a process of tech development and articulate them clearly so that, regular people can understand, and then, get them out there so that there's a norm created in the industry of everybody kind of doing something like this.
So talk a little bit, if you don't mind, talk a little bit more about red teaming. Just make sure people understand it's a technique that's pretty commonly used by tech companies. As you said, I think there are, standards and techniques that people are coming together, but talk a little bit about that as an example.
Yeah, so red teaming is, it's just having a bunch of domain experts and who are cognizant of various, sort of risk vectors based on their domain expertise, and you give them early access to the models, to the systems, and they will try to get the systems to do things that they think are risky based on their domain. And so, for example, you might have a red teaming expert who's an expert in disinformation to try to generate this kind of stuff. You might have an expert who is an expert in bias and accuracy issues to kind of articulate or generate outcomes that they think are problematic. And we surface these things, and then from there work on mitigations or safeguards so that the models don't actually exhibit this kind of behavior. An example of this is that if you go to ChatGPT today and you try to get it to do certain types of things, it will decline your request. It'll say, I can't do that, or I don't want to do that, or that's against my policies, and that's kind of an outcome of things that are surfaced by this process.
So some of you might have read a transcript by a New York Times reporter relatively early on in this. So I am curious, was there anyone on the red team that was trying to get it to say, I love you, I want to run away with you?
If they did, we didn't necessarily hear about it. I think that was implementation, I think, that you can get if you let it have too many turns and you have too much context. The reaction to kind of cabining that type of behavior was fairly quick, and so I think that was a learning experience for the industry at large.
So accuracy and bias are two issues that are fun challenges when it comes to artificial intelligence generally. Is there a way that you're thinking about those that is different than some of the other challenges? How are you thinking about internally doing the most that you can to try to mitigate the risk of inaccuracies?
Yeah, so I think there are two aspects to this. One is technical and one is social. Technical, we can, sort of work on. Social, is sort of we need, external input on to incorporate into our thinking. So technically, there is kind of this development trajectory that we're on where users can have more customization or preference tracking in the systems. And so you could see this, for example, and there's a demo done of GPT-4 by Greg Brockman, and you can see it on YouTube, where he puts in something called a system message, which kind of conditions the responses that the model will give you. And the reason I bring that up is because when you think about accuracy and bias, people can have different definitions of what that means. And so, for example, on accuracy, what was the cause of the Iraq War? Or, are taxes or government spending good for stimulating the economy? Who's the best player in the NBA? You can have different criteria, and you can have different, sort of outputs here that different people can disagree, and it could still be considered fact. And so part of it is preferences. But then it raises the question about who's deciding these things and what are the criteria, what are the standards that we're going to use. And we don't necessarily want to be the ones to make all those decisions. We can certainly work on best practices and establish norms. But I think this is sort of where all the engagement that has to happen with policymakers and advocates and our critics too. To think about how do we do this in a way that for most of society at large, it's going to be something that's acceptable.
So let's talk a little bit about policy. We're here in Washington, D.C. So just to kick it off, do you think the introduction or the release of ChatGPT, do you think it's changed the policy debate around artificial intelligence?
I think so. And it's a mixed bag, right? Because I think that, there are all these issues before, right? And now there's generative AI, and it's, the thing that I think people have now kind of gravitated to because the pace of change seems very, very rapid. And one of the things that is different about this is that generative AI can do stuff. It can make things. It can produce things. Whereas I think previously a lot of this stuff had to do with what kind of decisions are the systems making. This time around is what are the things being output by the systems. And I think that that raises an additional set of concerns, which is not a replacement for the prior concerns, but just an additional surface area of these things. And so I think that's sort of where you see this kind of, dash to understand, the implications right away. And, kind of going back to what I was talking about before, it's like if these systems can generate information, it can generate new content, how is that, content rolling out? Who's consuming it? What are the sort of disclosures that are required around this kind of stuff? Those are all the kind of the key questions I think that, everybody's kind of working through right now.
So on the one hand, there's an intensification of a policy debate that's been happening for some time. Do you think are there any new issues that you think are raised by ChatGPT, or do you think it's more an intensification of issues that have been there before? Yeah,
I think both. So intensification of existing issues would be the bias and accuracy issues I think you were talking about before. I think transparency and explainability are ones I think people were talking about prior to all these things, and now I think the additional things that people are thinking about are just the capabilities of these models, because the output is not necessarily deterministic. These are systems that understand language. They've been trained to generate language, and they do things in terms of outputs that you don't necessarily always know ahead of time what they're going to do. You sort of can understand a range of outcomes, but not the exact outcome. And so I think there's an additional layer of this, which is how do you then get to a point where you can understand these things, or surface these sort of behaviors, and so you sort of get additional ideas here, such as how do we determine the impact of these things, and how do we sort of surface what they're capable of, and then how do we make sure that people are aware of these things, because I think previously the systems were more analytical, rather than producing things.
So we're going to have a panel a little bit later on today where we're going to be talking about intellectual property and AI, which again has been an issue that has been out there for a while. But I think on intellectual property and perhaps on the patent side, but perhaps in particular on the copyright side, there are potentially some new issues, certainly some intensification of issues around that. Is that something you all have started to think about? How are you thinking about the implications for the intellectual property systems?
Yeah, so I think we first started to see this when the DALL-E tool was released, last year, which is the image generation tool. You can, describe what you want an image to look like, and it will generate a series of images that sort of match your description or, or approximations of what you describe.
And again, in a way that's very, very quick and can seem sort of, magical, certainly transformative.
Yeah. And so, one of the reactions that you saw, was from the artist community. I think, and there's a range of responses here, right? I think some artists were very excited because, hey, it's a new tool that I can use to create, express, and then on the other end of the spectrum, because there's existing content that the model was trained on. I think some artists were like, what does that actually mean to be an artist anymore? And I think there's also a sense of like, okay, how is sort of fair compensation going to work in this kind of scheme? And I think all these issues are still being worked out. And I think one of the things that we did sort of at the very beginning with DALL-E is, somebody on our communications team, took it upon herself, and God bless her, she went out and basically connected with a bunch of artists in the community, and we still have this community that's part of like a feedback loop that we have into these systems. And so I think this is where you sort of get the feedback that people might want to opt out. People might want to say these tools can't replicate my style. And these are questions I think that are new, and people want to look at again, perhaps, because the systems are sort of ones that we haven't seen before. And that's one example. I think the other is just trying to reconcile the system with how the models actually are trained and the amount of data that's out there. And so the text models, for example, they're trained on trillions of words. And so if you have a system where there's sort of like compensation on a per work basis, even if you were to do that, you are talking about parsing it out into many different pieces for everybody, and the sort of resulting compensation may not be satisfactory, right, on a per work basis. And then there's also the sort of age-old difficulty of transacting or kind of dealing with a lot of people at once, and now there's the volume is really high, and so I think trying to figure out a system where the tools are being used in a way where we're building things together rather than trying to kind of port over the old system into this is probably where that discussion needs to happen. And I think it's a very rich one, and we are in discussions with various people on this kind of thing, and we certainly will welcome more feedback.
I'm going to take it back to the tech for a second. So you made a reference to training on trillions and trillions of words. Can you talk just for a moment about large language models, and how that works and its significance to OpenAI?
Yeah. So this is like I think it's new in the sense that I think before, up until now, used to thinking about systems as sort of receptacles of the things that go into them. And so like a search index or a database, and if its information is connected to it, you think of it as inside the thing. And what is different about large language models and other sort of generative AI systems that are trained on these corpuses is that they don't actually retain a copy of these things. What they do is they learn from the actual material, and they generate all sorts of just mathematical constructs inside that when you then prompt it will run sort of an algorithm inside and kind of spit out the content on the other end. it's not like it's searching through it or actually querying it. It's there's a bunch of math, complicated math inside that then results in the output. And that's kind of the difference. And it's totally understand the newness of this, which is that we have these existing sort of models of how software works, and this one is a little bit different.
So you've talked a few times in different ways about unforeseen outcomes, essentially. Trying to elicit unforeseen outcomes, trying to anticipate what they are going to be. As a developer of artificial intelligence and looking at a product that is rapidly evolving, how do you think about how you all have to evolve? Like how, as a developer of artificial intelligence, are there things that you are going to need to change in how you do things internally because of unforeseen outcomes and results?
Yeah, I think, on this, I think at a very, very basic level, we just have to be really good listeners. Because we didn't, get into this to build a business per se. And that goes again all the way back to the original founding principles and the mission. We're doing this actually to create this technology because the people that work at OpenAI believe that it could be one of these things that is a tremendous benefit to society. Society is going to have a lot of input for us in terms of how they want the systems to be deployed, what kind of safeguards that they want. And we are doing this not, just because, we want a company to be successful. We want this to actually have the most positive impact on the world that we can while minimizing, the harms. And so that's probably where all this starts. And then taking care, I think, in terms of the amount of work that goes into testing these systems and understanding them before they are deployed. Again, going back to what I talked about before, you have this kind of safety process, in terms of the testing before the models are released, and continuing to get better at these things, and incorporating what we see out in the world in terms of the actual usage of these things back into the development cycle. And I think that's where we start. And certainly there could be improvements along the way, and very happy to listen to people that have suggestions for us on this.
Is there anything that we're in D.C., as you know, AI legislation regulation is not just something that is in D.C., it's happening at the state level, it's happening in Europe, it's happening around the world. Policymakers are looking at this. Is there anything that you would want to tell policymakers? Is there a place that you think the policy debate on artificial intelligence should go?
Yeah, so I think it first starts with, trying to get to some kind of standards. Those could start with industry standards and some sort of coalescing around that. Decision about whether or not to make those compulsory, and also then what's the process for updating them. I think those things are, probably, fertile ground for more conversation. And by standards, I mean, what kind of testing do you need to do? And to kind of go a layer deeper there's the things that we call evals, which you can just kind of think about as a fancy word for benchmarks. And so you might, for example, have a benchmark that runs a bunch of tests against these models and test for, does it generate toxic output when you really, really try very hard? What's the percentage of times that happens? When you kind of run, these analyses against these tools, what kind of, biases might be present and things like that. So that might be one. And then the other, I think, is because these systems are newer and people are still trying to understand them, the first place I think we'd, kind of think that it's a good first step would be to find ways in which policymakers and the government have as good of information as possible. That might involve things like, voluntary reporting of what's, the systems that are about to come online, providing that information in terms of just these are the capabilities. And so that will kind of create this sort of like information flow into the policymaking realm that, lets people make better decisions about how to shepherd in this technology.
So I know we are at time, but I'm going to ask you one more question. So you have seen the GPT AI model evolving. You've talked a little bit about that here today. What's next?
Yeah,
What are we going to see next?
So I think actually on this one, if you trace the evolution, the thing that we're most kind of working on is to make the systems more aligned with human intent, and we call that the alignment problem. And that is something that we are very focused on because that's where it starts when you're dealing with a system that is capable of doing things that you didn't necessarily expect from the very get-go. And you can see this in the evolution of the models where the very early ones, because they're essentially text prediction tools at the very beginning, would predict text that would sort of be coherent with what you asked for, but it wasn't exactly what you asked for. An example of this might be, I might ask it, tell me about, Nashville, Tennessee, and then, the follow-on response might be, Tennessee, is the name of a character in a play. And that is coherent, sort of completion, but it's not actually what you wanted. And we call that, the way that we fix this is instruction following. And you have the system where people provide sort of idealized responses in terms of like the querying and the Q&A sort of process with the model. And the model is able to then, from a few examples, generalize this behavior and get better at doing what people tell it to do. And I think that is the long-running thread to all of this, which is, we're making these systems for us, right? We're not making them so that it can kind of just, be nice, shiny objects, but, to basically make human beings more productive, have, more beneficial uses. And so that starts with, the systems, doing as much as possible to be aligned with what you want them to do.
Thank you, Jason, so much for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure to have you.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, great to see you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Wait, this way?
Yes.
Okay.